An unfamiliar call sounded faintly from the terrain ahead. At around the distance, an NFL quarterback might heave a pigskin. Percy, my young English setter, forged before me in the direction of the noise. A bird call, to be sure, but what was it? I quickened my pace on the flinty soil of a serrated ridge, dodging sagebrush and prickly pear to peer into a sparse copse of stunted junipers from which came the calls. The vocalizations were now louder, with a chuckling staccato sounding more panicked than social. As Percy slowed in anticipation of a point, the frothing chorus boiled over with an eruption of grayish birds flushing in every direction. I frantically shouldered my semi-automatic 12-gauge and proceeded to trigger 3 ineffectual rounds, the last of which pulled one tiny gray feather from the rump of a departing bird. We'd found the chukars for which we'd been searching, but less than 2 hours after the Montana sunrise, the thin foothills atmosphere was already absorbing heat from a stifling early September sun. Percy panted enthusiastically in the direction of the departed birds. When he returned moments later, he accosted me with a "Come on, weakling, let's get going" stare and a hopeful pace in the direction the bulk of the covey had flown. "Too hot," I admonished the panting pooch. "We'll get after them another day." For the next 4 months, we hunted chukars on a semi-regular basis, a 3-year-old dog, vacillating unpredictably between green and seasoned, and an inexperienced hunter whose shooting was more erratic than the workings of his dog. In truth, we'd lucked out on our first chukar encounter. Although the State Game Agency advertises that there's an established population of the Eurasian partridges in the area, local hunters understand that established and plentiful are entirely different attributes. We'd stumbled into the covey after blundering into one of the bird's favorite niches of habitat in a 200-square-mile region which chukars are purported to range. I'd once seen chukars in Idaho and killed a couple of pen-raised birds at a media event on a hunt at a dude ranch in Colorado. But neither the dog nor I had previously experienced the thrill of finding and flushing a covey of wild chukars. I determined Percy would fetch a specimen of the Alectoris chukar species to hand by the end of the season. Hell, by the end of September if I could shoot straighter. For his part, the dog seemed in on the deal. Although chukar habitat is punishing to pointing dogs, the rangy setter, I knew, would run his paws ragged in search of the birds among the twisted draws, ledge-tiered ridges, and cactus-covered hilltops they called home. We returned to the chukar haunts in a fortnight, just after dawn, the forecast portending another unseasonably warm day in early autumn. As I steered the vehicle into a pullout from the county road onto a parcel of public land, the exuberant setter in the seat next to me peered out the side window, whining crazily like a starving prisoner eyeing a buffet table just beyond the confines of his cell. The source of Percy's overstimulation became evident when I switched off the ignition and scanned our surroundings. A robust covey of chukars was sprinting up a steep, mostly barren slope opposite the vehicle. Most of the birds hustled along in 2 lines, the leaders of which appeared to compete with one another on a race to the top. Since our last outing, I'd done a bit of research on our red-legged quarry. Chukars, I learned, like to run up and fly down. I grabbed my shotgun from the rear of the Ford Expedition and commanded the overwrought setter to heel. We hustled along the bulwark of the ridge the birds scaled, intending to loop ahead of them on the assumption they'd bivouac once they reached the top. Just below the summit, a head-high sandstone cliff blocked our passage. I scrambled around it on the near side, saving a traverse of 100 yards to reach its opposite end. We panted onto the level summit of the ridge and walked directly into some 20 ground-dwelling birds, whose lower appendages measuring in inches propelled them to the meetup almost as quickly as those of a full-grown human and his young dog. The covey flushed before I could even raise the barrel of the Weatherby, gliding effortlessly across the ravine at the bottom of which our rig was parked. A handful of birds had beaten the bulk of the covey to the flush, but I clearly marked the majority, settling into a shallow pocket near the ridgetop on the far side. "We'll get into them again," I confidently assured my canine. It proved a prophetic pronouncement, but not in the manner I anticipated. We plunged off the hillside in the direction of the departed partridges. A narrow ravine, clotted with low junipers, snaked toward the location where the birds alighted, a convenient cattle trail wandering along its top. Halfway up, I noticed Percy was no longer at my side. I looked back down the trail to see the foolish youngster on point, his gaze fixed on a clump of junipers not 10 feet from the path I'd just passed over. "Percy, come," I commanded. He refused. I jogged downslope to accost the recalcitrant 3-year-old who still occasionally pointed odd subjects: meadowlarks, voles, tweety birds, and hiding cottontail rabbits. Hopefully, this wasn't a porcupine. "Forget it," I scolded the hopeful pointer, my shaming coinciding with whirring wings as a trio of chukars fought clear of the scrubby evergreens. Although I was unprepared for the shot, the birds were forced to fly upward before veering upslope, losing precious time in their escape. I managed to shoulder the 12-gauge and happily watched the trailing chukar fold at the report. Perhaps it was my imagination, but Percy appeared more than a mite smug as he blissfully retrieved the bird. We scoured the hills for another hour, but never found the rest of the covey. The birds, Percy pointed, I concluded, were the few early risers from the previous flush. Chukars, I learned, love to run, but will also hide and hold, behavioral patterns that are maddeningly unpredictable. We hunted partridges for the final time as the winter holiday season waned, searching for them not in the fabled pear tree, but again on the stern soil and trying topography in which they are found. This time, a coating of snow blanketed the landscape. Although it made the slopes more slippery, it proved a boon for chukar chasing. The first covey we encountered was pinned by our following their tri-toed tracks in the snow. Percy ranged relentlessly over the landscape, bumping a couple of hunkered coveys, but enjoying a newfound fact: chukars aren't nearly as inclined to run or run as far, with their skimpy strides impeded by snow. At the end of the day, I'd bagged 5 birds, what should have been a limit of 8 with competent shooting. The next season, we hit the hills with great anticipation. In 4 outings, we had found few birds, harvesting but 1. Hoping for an upswing, we returned the following year to be shut out completely. With that, the chukar chronicles of my upland hunting snapped shut for nearly a decade. The diary reopened 8 years later with Lance, Percy's son, stomping his paws on the seat next to me and whining in anticipation of a morning hunt. An early September morning with a hot day in the forecast, and the vehicle parked at dawn in the same location as his father's first foray provided the backdrop for Lancey on his first chukar hunt. I'd initially planned to hunt gray partridges on another parcel of public land, but found a pair of pickups and a half-dozen hunters and their dogs ahead of us. As we hiked up a long draw away from the pullout, it struck me that Lance was 3 years old, the same age as Percy on his first chukar hunt. But what they shared in age, they diverged in many characteristics. Where his sire was a big running dog with endless stamina, Lance had neither his speed nor endurance. Where Percy was willful and necessarily kept under thumb, Lance was sensitive and easily cowed with a mild scolding. He was, however, possessed of a keen nose and a notable aptitude for locating game. As one hunting companion put it poetically the previous season, "That little turd can sure find a bird." Despite Lance's best efforts, we returned to the vehicle empty-handed and without a single partridge encounter as the morning warmed. Up ahead of me, Lance neared the location where Percy and I had stumbled into our first chukars years ago. My nostalgic remembrance ruptured when I noticed his feathery tail motionless in a cluster of sagebrush. Breaking point, he crept ahead as I hustled to catch up. When he stopped again, I could hear the singular sound of nervous chukars just ahead. The partridges flushed to port in a flurry, with some 30 pairs of wings beating the thin air in frantic flight. By then, I'd traded my semi-auto for an over-under 12 bore. I swung the barrels smoothly in the direction of the nearest bird, which crumpled at the shot, then dropped a second a few yards beyond and behind the first. As I watched dumbfounded, chukars kept flushing from the brush. Collecting my wits, I stuffed 2 more Norsven 18.2 loads into the gun. A single bird careened off the ridge to the right. I swung with more urgency on the second shot, and the bird tumbled. Lance had found 1 partridge by the time I retrieved the spent cartridges. We quickly located the second on an exposed slab of sandstone. The third necessitated a considerable search, finally nosed by the setter much further down the steep ravine than I had anticipated, lodging in the lower branches of spreading juniper. A mostly self-taught dog trainer and wing shooter, I reflected on my progress over the 8 years intervening between chukar encounters with my brace of 3-year-old setters. After far too many episodes of second-guessing, I'd finally learned to trust the dogs. Mostly. A half-dozen outings to a skeet range and a session with a professional instructor had dramatically improved my shooting. Analyzing the morning's encounter, it seemed at least 50 birds had flushed in front of my 4-footed friend. Lance, it appeared, would get an immersion in chukars just as his sire had in the season before his 4th birthday. A chilly morning in mid-October found both dogs and me motoring for a tiny sliver of public land where I'd previously found pheasants. Idling down a dusty 2-track. On a flat, I spotted a covey of partridges walking across the lane at some distance. I marked their location and parked. Percy followed happily at heel as we closed the distance to the birds. Shoulder-high sagebrush impeded my footsteps and vision as I followed the senior setter into the tangle. When the covey flushed, I anticipated swinging in the direction of gray partridges as I'd killed them previously in the same vicinity. But the birds sported the barred sides and reddish beaks of chukars. One fell in as many shots, the rest winging away toward a steep hillside, with several scattering and alighting on the flat. Percy found the bird, relishing the retrieve in a manner only known to elder gun dogs. Anticipating the youth would work the heavy cover more efficiently than his aging sire, I swapped dogs and headed into the sage. Its height lowered as we neared the edge of the flat, where I'd seen singles alighting. Were the birds still on the flat, or had they run up the canted hillside at its edge? Lance snapped onto point not far ahead. When I neared him, a narrow washout with steep sides proved the location of his interest. It seemed an odd place for a hiding chukar, but the dog's always right? The birds, of course, timed their flush perfectly with my off-balance scramble into the wash. The last of the half-dozen delayed its departure seconds after the others, offering just enough time to regain my footing and shoot. Lance had his bird, with a partridge in the pouch in the back of my vest. I heard chukars clucking to one another as they jogged up the hillside, a long and daunting slope. My quads were burning and lungs heaving when I reached the summit, just in time to see Lance bump a covey of birds from the upwind side of a small patch of sagebrush, the only cover on the flat, grassy top of the hill. The chukars were easily within range, but with the shotgun dangling from my hand in a trail carry, they were gone before I could even think to shoot. Our luck turned at the point of the escarpment above the vehicle. Lancey put up a pretty point in a cluster of basketball-sized stones just below the brink. A handful of chukars dove downward in a flash. My first shot flew high, but swinging forcefully lower, I managed to drop a bird on the next. As I waited for the young dog to scramble a long way down the slope to find the bird, I viewed the stern landscape and our vehicle, which looked far away. An old dog, I knew, was whining and pacing inside, hoping for his share of the action. He couldn't know it, but his son's Three-Peat was much improved over his own, on account of his master's education in the intervening years. He won't live to see a grandson's chukar immersion as a youngster, if the bird gods so grace him. But by then, perhaps the handler will get it perfectly. Or not.